welcome to Conversations on Social Work Careers. My name is Jennifer Luna, and I write for the New Social Worker magazine. I write a column called Your Social Work Career Coach. And today I am here to interview a dear friend and colleague of mine, Dr. Jonathan Singer. And Jonathan is a professor at Loyola University, but most recently he was awarded Social Work Pioneer. And I want to tell you, Jonathan, that this interview is so special to me because I've known you since you were a student, and I'm not going to say the year, but
It was 2019. I'm just kidding.
oh no, yeah, I was like, oh. But Jonathan, when I think about you, the first thing I think of is cool jazz. And we can get into that a little bit more, but I'm all about the brand.
Mhm.
And one of the things that makes you so special to many people is the way that you bring people together, the way that you connect folks through many different outlets. But after all these years, I feel like I could talk to you any day and would pick up right where we left off. And I think those are the most cherished friendships. So with that, I'd like for you to start off and tell us a little bit about yourself.
Yeah, well, thanks, Jennifer. I'm really excited about this conversation. And I love the fact that we have been having conversations for many, many years. Always a delight. So I'm a professor at Loyola University Chicago. I'm the past president of the American Association of Suicidology. Uh, I'm the founder and host of the Social Work Podcast. Um, I serve on the steering committee for the Suicide Prevention Resource Center. I'm on the advisory board for the JED Foundation. I do a lot of work around suicide prevention. I also do a lot of tech related things. So I'm the co-lead of the Social Work Grand Challenge, Harness Technology for Social Good. I used to be the secretary for the international HUSITA, which is an organization that was founded like 30 some years ago around computers and social work. I'm on council on,
Acronym?
yeah, HUSITA, HUSITA.
Okay.
Um, um, the Human Services and Information Technology Association. Um, and I'm also on the technology advisory group for the Council on Social Work Education. And so these are a bunch of things that I do, and I recently published the second edition of my best-selling book, Suicide in Schools: A Practitioner's Guide.
Congratulations.
Thank you.
I'm always that's why one of the reasons why I had you introduce yourself. Um, but I'm always so impressed with all of the different areas that you touched
Mm,
that all have a technology undertone.
mhm.
And the nomination for Pioneer Award was predominantly because of the Social Work Podcast.
Right.
And so I'd like for you to tell us a little bit about the history of that, when it started, and kind of how it's evolved throughout the years. I think it was the first social work podcast, correct?
It was. It was the first podcast by and for social workers in the world. My understanding is that there was a radio show out of a university in Scotland that was by social workers about social work.
Wow.
Um, but as far as a podcast, meaning something that somebody could subscribe to and get the episodes pushed to their devices, right? In the beginning, it was computers, and then it was iPods, and now it's your smartphones. The Social Work Podcast was the first, and the reason why I started it was because podcasts got started around 2004, 2005. Um, they really picked up steam when iTunes opened up the podcast store in 2005. And you had big radio programs like This American Life and Fresh Air and some of those other ones, they became podcasts. And so for the first time, you could just download an episode of This American Life to your iPod and listen to it. Like you didn't have to wait till it showed up on the radio, or sit at your computer and listen to it. It was kind of remarkable. And I was teaching at the University of Pittsburgh. I was a doctoral student, and I was teaching a practice theories course. And I remember there was one student who drove 2.5 hours to get to class. Now, she had scheduled all of her classes for one day,
Wow.
and she would spend the night. She'd take another class, then she'd drive home. And we were talking, and she said, "I wish I had my textbooks as audiobooks." Now these days you can get them as audiobooks, right? She didn't have a visual disability, so she couldn't get the university to convert her textbook into audio, right? And that's certainly an ADA option. But I thought to myself, you know what? There's a lot of great material that we're talking about in here that she would love to learn from on the go.
Right.
And then also I realized after talking with my students, most of them had rented their textbooks and they were going to sell them back. And so why not record summaries of my lectures? And so that's how it started. Now, the wild thing is that you and I talked about this like back in 2008 for the 1 year anniversary
I
of,
remember that. Yeah.
yeah, of the podcast. And so much of what we talked about continues to be true about the value of the podcast and how people love to learn on the go. They love to have something that's social work specific. They've told me that they really appreciate the fact that I provide a context and, that I make the episodes evergreen, right? That it's sort of like the content is just as useful today as it was 10 years ago, so they can re-listen to it. In fact, the stats suggest that the majority of people who listen to social work podcasts listen to 6 or more episodes.
Wow.
Yeah.
Wow. How many downloads do you have after all these years?
It's about 8 million.
Oh,
I say about 8 million because in 2017, I switched my analytics service. I had been using the web metrics that came with a server that I was paying for, and it was good. But then I went to something called PodTrack, which is the service that big name places use, and so I felt a
okay.
lot more confident about my stats. And there have been over 6 million downloads since then. And so, I add a couple of million for the first
Yeah.
10 years just because it's probably an undercount. It could be
Yeah.
closer to 10
Yeah.
million, but just to be on the safe side, I say about 8 million at this point.
Isn't that something how I call the student that was driving back and forth to class for long periods of time. I call those career moments. Just
Mm,
thing that can happen in your career that has an impact for your whole career trajectory.
yeah,
And I'm and now they're so commonplace. And I know that so many professors even assign your podcasts
yeah,
for people to listen to. Um, Tell me about so there's a lot more now. There's a lot more social work podcasts.
that's right.
And as a matter of fact, I don't even know how many. I would probably guess maybe like over 200 or more.
I don't know. Melanie Sage, who used to be a professor at University of Buffalo, um, she started a Google spreadsheet where people could add information about social work related podcasts. The interesting thing is that some of the podcasts that were started have gone inactive, right?
Yeah.
And so you get podcasts that start, podcasts that stop. There are a lot of podcasts that aren't on the list. And you might get podcasts that are recorded by social workers that don't really have much to do with social work. So I think that's one of the exciting things about podcasting, right? Because you have this technology where anybody, with, a smartphone
Yeah.
can get high quality audio and then upload it, which is very different than when I started in 2007. Um, like you actually had to like hand code the RSS feed, and you had to get a
Oh
server.
my
There were no podcasting services. Um, and so so I'm not sure how many there are. I know that I would say there are probably 15 social work related podcasts that I would say are really um, either speaking to core concepts that all social workers should know, or really pushing back against some of the issues that
Right.
social workers are maybe traditionally focused on. So
More like that advocacy.
yeah.
Do you feel competition out there?
No. I don't feel, maybe I should. Maybe that would get me to be more regular in my posting of podcast episodes. I know I recorded an interview with you that I still haven't published. And maybe if I felt like people were going to scoop me on that, I would get to it more readily. But
I'm going to start scooting you on that.
no,
Yep.
so I think that, and I said this early on, social work is so broad and deep that I don't know that we could have too many social work related podcasts. Like for example, if you look at Shimon Cohen's Doing the Work podcast, right? And Shimon and I, we wrote a piece for New Social Worker and recorded it as a podcast episode. Um, his work is looking at folks who are doing social work explicitly around structural change, right?
Right.
So going out there, being involved in anti-racist, abolitionist, social work practice, policy. He's taking on a bunch of topics that the social work podcast doesn't take on. Not that I don't want to or couldn't. It's just not something that I have focused on. Um, Similarly, you have folks like Mim Fox in Australia, who has a Social Work Stories podcast where she has folks come on anonymously and tell
Oh, wow.
stories. And she and her co-host, they talk about, they process, um, but she's able to bring voices to the fore that somebody might not want to share about and be identified. And so I mean, those are two very different kinds of podcasts. But again, it's not the kind of podcast that I do. Um, there are podcasts that don't exist in social work that I think could be wonderful, such as more investigative or narrative style podcast episodes. Like, for example, there is um, uh, a court case called Tarasoff that kind of established that mental health professionals have a duty to warn if a client is making threatening statements about somebody else. And the NASW Code of Ethics was updated in the last few years to say if that person was threatening a group of people, right, you could break confidentiality. Well, I think it would be amazing to do a podcast episode where I follow up on what happened.
Oh, yes.
Right? What happened
Right.
to the guy who was at the center of this, who shot and killed somebody and then was deported?
Yeah.
What kind of life did he live? What does it mean that we have this ruling based on this thing? And we don't really know anything about the person, right? And so I think it would be really interesting. But nobody does those kinds of podcasts in social work.
So it sounds like there's plenty of room to grow.
Yes. Yes. Thank you. That is the whole point. There's
Yeah.
lots of topics, lots of like approaches to podcasts that people don't do. So there's plenty of space.
I'm curious about your award.
Mm-hmm.
And um, I I think you're one of the youngest pioneers I've ever met or seen.
I think so.
And I definitely don't think you've peaked.
Oh God, I hope not.
And I'm just wondering if you could tell us some things that you did in your career to be intentional about
Mhm.
where you landed, and maybe some things that you might do going forward.
Yeah, sure. Um, so one of the first things that I did was very intentional was that after many years of direct practice, I chose to go back and get a PhD. Um, and I did this, it was in part because of conversations I had with Dean Barbara White and David Springer, who was the associate dean at that time at the University of Texas at Austin, um, about some of the things that I had been doing in my social work practice. And I was kind of complaining that there was no research about these issues. And specifically, there were family based interventions for suicidal youth. Um, and they were basically like, look, if you want there to be family like empirically supported interventions, you should go do that because you work with families of suicidal kids. Like you know how it's done. So go become a researcher. I didn't want to become a researcher. I was like, that sounds terrible. Um, and but I talked with my now wife, and we kind of made some intentional decisions about what our lives would look like if I left direct practice, went back to become a professor. Um, and then when I was uh, a professor, so after starting the podcast, after getting the PhD, um, I made the intentional choice to leave Temple University before going up for tenure, um, because it was clear that because of changes at Temple University, um, it was questionable whether or not I would be supported at the dean's level. The school was supporting me, but was the dean going to? It was a new dean. um, and that was a terrifying moment in my career. I had, I had young kids. We had made a life for ourselves in Philadelphia, in Mount Airy. We had family, friends that we loved, a beautiful home, like all these sorts of things. And do I give up the possibility of tenure? So I went on the job market. And when I was on the job market, I really got clear um, that my job at Temple was no longer a good fit for what I was interested in doing,
Mm,
and 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 I wasn't a good fit for Temple. They
yeah,
wanted somebody who did things differently, who thought about things differently.
yeah,
And I would never say that I would have been selfish to stick around. Like, say, an alternate universe, I would get tenure. I mean, there were a
right,
lot of my colleagues who were not happy, but
right,
everybody who has a tenure line job and doesn't like it is just taking up space that somebody else could take.
right.
Who
And
might
that might
love it, right?
be
That's right.
right,
It might be a
exactly.
better fit. And when I talked to the folks at Loyola University Chicago, Christy Mason and Susan Grossman, um, I I remember walking away from that interview thinking, wait a minute, I just talked about all these things that I was interested in, and they said, that sounds great. You should come to Loyola and do those things. And I just hadn't gotten that kind of support at Temple University. Again, no diss on the people. It was
Right.
that the business of Temple University wasn't interested in what I was offering. And so
Yep.
I got to Loyola, and the things I wanted to do, they wanted me to do. And the things they wanted me to do, I was like, great, I'd love to do that. So it ended up becoming this really great fit.
Right.
Uh, and it was a reminder that you can work really hard in a job to make things fit. But if you're a circle and they're a square, it's just not ever going to fit. Right. And so going out there and finding something that'll fit both of you is going to be best for everyone.
That is great advice, because I think a lot of times when we're dissatisfied or with our jobs or in almost any situation in life, um, we always look inward towards ourselves first, like
Yeah.
it's our fault,
Yeah.
you
Hmm.
know, and um, having taken a calculated risk myself lately, um, you know, I wish I could go back and it's definitely a lesson to
Hmm.
learn that it's okay to take risks.
Yeah.
And what about going forward?
Hmm.
Um, I don't want you to have to spill any secrets or anything, but what
There.
what things you might do to, grow your career even more?
Mhm.
I don't even know what's beyond a pioneer,
I know.
right?
So what? Well, so in the academy, there are a couple of things that I, would be nice feathers in my cap. But I don't know if they're going to happen, and they're not things that I have any ego investment in, right? Like being inducted in the American Academy of Social Work and Social Welfare as a fellow. That probably is never going to happen for me, even though I've been part of the grand challenge from the beginning. Um, just having seen who they induct. So there are those sorts of things. But I think for me, so my area has always been schools, suicide, families, and then technology. Um, there are so many things that I want to do. Like, I'll just throw this out. So, generative AI has been all the buzz for the last year, um, and it will continue to be important moving forward. What it's going to look like in 5 years, I have no idea. Um, but I just published this second edition of Suicide in Schools, and I had the brainstorm that as much as I love the book and it's got amazing information, what's true is that it wasn't written for people to sit down and read, from cover to cover. It's a
Right.
resource guide,
Yep.
and how have we been trained to interact with information um, over the last 20 years? Well, we search for it,
We look it
right?
up.
We look it up. We're looking for the exact information we're looking for, um, and it and one of the things that AI holds the promise of is if I were to be able to train an AI chatbot using suicide in schools as the source material with some of the articles that I've read or written, um, some of the other things that I have that can provide context. If I could put in the codes of ethics for different professions, best practices for schools, uh, then what we would have is we would have a chatbot where somebody could, who's in school, say, "Hey, um, we just got this email from the superintendent saying they want us to do this. How does that fit with the best practices for suicide prevention policies and protocols?" And be specific, provide the guidelines exact verbatim, and then what it would do is it would spit it out, right?
Wow.
And how useful would that be? So
Right.
that technology is there, it's possible. I would love to be able to think and to help innovate so that in the future, social workers are not writing textbooks that people buy and put on their shelves, but rather that they're these interactive things. What does that mean? Does that mean I don't have to worry about writing beautiful paragraphs anymore? Do I just need to have the basic information that then gets turned into beautiful text because the
Right.
chatbot is trained to write like that? I mean, there's so many possibilities, Jennifer.
Right.
And on the other side, I mean, that's sort of an integration of the suicide and the technology piece. But in terms of the podcast, some of the things I was talking about before about doing more detailed audio documentaries, about doing stories that are more narrative, that lead people through ideas in ways that I currently don't. I would love to be able to do that.
I think that another way that you're a trailblazer is by leaning into the these things, technology from since 2006,
Hmm.
um, AI now. we see so many people that are either scared of it or judgmental of
Yeah.
it. And there's so many possibilities, and it's not going to go away. And it's, to me, I compare it to Google Maps or Alexa, and so I'm so excited for the future of your work, because I mean that's going to save lives.
Yeah, I mean, hopefully it'll at the very least, hopefully it'll make it easier for school providers, school
Mhm.
staff, people in the community, to feel more confident that what they're doing
Right.
has either an evidence base, or that it's considered a best practice, or if it's not, to keep a running list of what those things are, because that's invaluable. Um, yeah, so many things. And that's just the practice side of it all. I could talk on and on and on, but
I do have another question related to the podcast.
yes.
What are some things that social work podcasts aren't doing, in your opinion, that might change the landscape of podcasting going forward, either in education or in practice?
hmm um, so I think there are several things that social work related podcasts are not doing. I sort of alluded to some of those, right, in terms of the ways that podcasts are done, like not having narrative podcasts. I think one of the other things that is really valuable about podcasting as a medium is that um, it gets ideas out there, um, in a way that's more accessible than the ways that ideas have gotten out there traditionally. If you think about the content that's online, there's always shows that are like, we're today we're joined by this lawyer and this MBA and this person from political science department, and they're going to be answering questions about working with families in poverty, or domestic violence, or whatever. And I'm like, why aren't there social workers on these shows, right? And there
Right,
are lots of reasons. One, because social workers are out there doing the work.
right.
Right? We don't have marketing teams.
We keep a low
Um,
profile.
that's right. And so I think something that social work related podcasts are not doing that I think could be really valuable is to actually have shows where you have a panel of social workers that are addressing issues that most people don't think that social workers know how to address, right? So,
Yeah,
like,
yeah.
whatever the topic is, it might be related to economics, it might be related to urban planning, it might be related to this and this. And I'm not saying every social worker can answer these questions. Obviously they can't, and obviously there are some things that are in our scope of expertise and some things that are not. But if you are if you are working if you've been working for 4 or 5 years doing an embedded community ethnography, with folks looking at housing insecurity, looking at the ways that houses are built, where they're built, all these sorts of things, you've been to these meetings, like, you have a good idea of what urban planning is around policies. If somebody has questions about that, why not a social work lens, right? Why not have the social worker answer that? So I think that that's one way that you could take social work and bring the insights and the ethics of social work to a much broader audience, in a way that doesn't happen now.
And with that being said, on the flip side, um, how do you find the people for your podcasts? Or if somebody wanted to be, if a social worker says, "Oh, that sounds like a great idea, I'd love to do that," how would they prepare for that? Because
Mhm.
we know that there's a lot of people that want to be on podcasts or interviewed
Right.
but aren't prepared. So how would they prepare for that? How would they demonstrate it? And then how would they get in?
Yeah. Okay. So there are a couple things. One, um, there are a handful of people who are just sort of naturally fascinating and gifted speakers, and those people are just fun to talk to. Um, Most of us are not like that, so we have to do some preparation. What I would say is that if you're interested in being on a podcast, I would make sure that you've listened to lots of people on podcasts who are talking about what you want to talk about, and make sure that you're saying something different. Make sure you're saying something that nobody else has said. It
That
doesn't
is
have to be
advice.
completely different or opposite. It just has to be a different kind of take.
Yeah,
Um, and and then you can reach out to podcasters. You want to find out, like, why is it important for them to hear my message? Yeah, it might be nice for you to be like, hey, I was on this podcast, but like, what does the podcast program that you are going on, like, what does it get out of you? um, uh, and then in terms of prepping, what I always tell my guests is that a couple things, depending on sort of how used to public speaking they are and how comfortable they are with their topic. But you could easily say something like, um, I want you to imagine that, yes, you're talking to me, but there's somebody that's out there that you want to understand the information that you're sharing. Imagine who that is. Imagine that you're talking to that person, and that'll just help you to make sure that when you're talking, that you're providing enough of the right information for that person to understand what what the main points are. Also, I tell people to tell stories, because that's what people remember. People remember stories, right?
right, right, right. Yeah. It's kind of like putting yourself in the room with them,
Yeah,
with your audience.
yeah, exactly.
That's awesome. Well, I just want to again congratulate you on your award.
Thank you.
And this has all been such great information from somebody who might want to be on a podcast, to how you started your career, how you've diversified your career, and how you were intentional. And we will have the podcast in the show notes for anybody. I can't imagine there's anybody who hasn't heard of it or seen it or listened to it before. But thank you so much for doing this interview. And I can't wait to interview you in a few more years and see what you're up to then.
I can't wait to be back talking about what's going on. And by the way, and thank you so much for supporting my application for the Pioneer. Um,
Oh, it's my
that
pleasure.
meant the world. So thank you. And thanks for having me on today.